iGlobenews brings global views.
Welcome to our weekly video podcast series. My name is Diana Mautner-Markov. I'm editor-in-chief of iGlobenews.org. And today, to discuss world politics and current events, is world-renowned China expert Professor Susanne Weigel-Schwirtzig. Please remember to like, follow, and subscribe. And thank you for tuning into our discussion today. We will be discussing Ukraine, EU, and Russia backing into World War III. And for the record, this session was recorded on June 17th, 2026. The funding for the war in Ukraine is now coming almost entirely from the European Union, in addition to some other countries such as Canada, Australia, and Great Britain. While the EU has officially started membership talks with Ukraine, the European public is divided on support for Ukraine. With the war and the corruption in Ukraine, it could take up to 10 years for Ukraine to become an EU member state. So the question also is this not just a smokescreen to divert attention away from the fact that the EU has no plan how to end the war in Ukraine? According to a recent YouGov poll, the support for a negotiated peace in Ukraine is growing in all European countries, except for in Poland and Great Britain. In Italy, Germany, France, and Spain, more people support a negotiated peace than a continuation of the war. What policy is the EU pursuing with regard to the war in Ukraine? Starting membership talks will not end the war in Ukraine, but might antagonize Russia even more.
I think we are in a very precarious situation because structurally speaking, at this particular moment, while the US is trying to walk away from the war, and to walk away from Europe, Europe needs to create a situation where it can actually hope to sustain cohesion. So from a political point of view, a very easy way to create cohesion is by defining a joint enemy. And of course, by defining Russia as our joint enemy, we can somewhat replace the role of the US as the overlord over the situation in EU Europe by this common enemy. In previous times, when the US was very much interested in preserving the cohesion of Europe, it invested quite a lot, not only militarily, but also politically, in making Europe work the way the US wanted it to work. And part of this plan was the cohesion of EU Europe and the expansion, of course, of EU Europe into Eastern Europe after the end of the Cold War. Now that the US is walking away from Europe, we need yet another factor to hold us together. And this is our common fear of Russia. And this implies that the leadership of the European countries today think that the division of their societies into those who support the war in Ukraine and those who do not want their respective countries to continue supporting Ukraine, they think that this is a minor factor in comparison to the need of the EU European countries to actually not fall apart. And this is why they are pursuing this kind of policy.
So let me break down your question a little bit and start maybe with the Cold War era, which you mentioned also. During the Cold War, there was a hostile security competition between the United States and the USSR. Both sides developed nuclear arsenals, and both sides realized that a nuclear war would be catastrophic for all. Neither side crossed the red lines, which were respected by the West and the USSR, because the fear of nuclear escalation was so great back then. Nowadays, it seems that this fear has totally vanished in the West, and the red lines from the Cold War have disappeared. For instance, when Ukraine, which is a US ally, invaded Russia's Kursk region in August 2024, or when Ukraine attacked one leg of Russia's nuclear triad in 2025 with its Operation Spiderweb. History shows one should not back Russia into a corner. To avoid a drawn-out escalation, Russia could attack military or symbolic targets in Europe. So far, Putin has refrained from using nuclear weapons. So my question is, can Russia restore the viability of nuclear deterrence without using a nuclear weapon? Would it take an escalation like this to push Europe and the US to respect Russia's red lines? And has the West forgotten that Russia has the largest nuclear arsenal?
Well, the West seems to have forgotten that Russia has the largest nuclear arsenal. And if I talk of the West in this situation, I think we actually have to differentiate between the US and Europe, because according to my analysis of the situation, the three great nuclear powers, US, China, and Russia, are all very much aware of the inherent risks and dangers of going to war against each other, because if they go to war against each other, this war will very quickly escalate into a nuclear war. And this nuclear war will have a dimension that is actually fatal to the world at large. So because they know this, they actually try to compromise with each other. They try to be friendly with each other, even though they are, of course, competitors for world hegemony. And for example, just recently, when Donald Trump had his 80th birthday, Vladimir Putin gave a call and actually talked to him for over an hour, because Vladimir Putin wanted to make sure that while Russia is talking in more and more adversary terms about Europe, they want to differentiate between Europe and the US. And I think this is yet another signal that they actually know about the dangers of a nuclear war. But from a European point of view, they can only define for the population in Europe Russia to be our main enemy if they overlook the nuclear factor. Because once you calculate the nuclear factor as an important factor in this equation, then you cannot walk up the escalation ladder anymore. And for that reason, we have to downgrade the risks and dangers inherent in a potential nuclear attack from Russia. On the other hand, for Russia to claim a world power status is not so easy. And it's quite interesting to see that while Donald Trump and Xi Jinping know very well that they have to accept Russia as a world power, whenever you talk to European politicians, they will tell you that, Russia is such a minor power. First of all, their GDP is just on the level of Italy. And secondly, we can see from the fact that they move so slowly into Ukrainian territory that their army is not as powerful as everybody thinks it is. So we can actually regard Russia as a minor actor. And they actually feel that the European Union is a much more powerful actor if compared to Russia. And one of the reasons why we do not look at the nuclear potential of Russia is because we cannot argue that Russia is a minor actor in the international system if we look at the fact that Russia is the country with the biggest nuclear power. So Russia only has one way of showing the Europeans that they should take Russia as a world power, and this is by threatening a nuclear assault. And I think this is a very, very dangerous situation. On the one hand, this nuclear weapon is the only way, it seems at least at this moment, for Russia to convince Europe that it is a nuclear power, and that because it is a nuclear power, it has to be taken as a world power. And on the other hand, the EU actually needs Russia as this main enemy by overlooking its nuclear power. And these two factors, when they come together, they have this potential of a false assessment on the side of the EU and a need to walk up the escalation ladder, even to the point of using tactical nuclear weapons on the side of Russia. This is not a good situation for any one of us living in Europe.
So, but do you think that it would be enough for Russia to just threaten the use of a nuclear weapon? Or do you think Russia would actually have to use a tactical, smaller nuclear weapon to somehow remind the Europeans, I'm here to stay, I'm an important great power on this planet, and you, the Europeans, are not a great power on this planet?
Well, I think that the Russian leadership is aware of the inherent risks. If they use nuclear weapons, they do not know in advance, or it's very difficult for them to assess in advance how the European Union will act or how the European leaderships will react to this use of nuclear weapons. Never ever in history has a country used nuclear weapons in a situation where there is the potential of retaliation. So we don't know what will happen if Russia uses a nuclear weapon against any target in NATO countries. Will the US actually retaliate by using its nuclear weapons in Europe against Russia? Or will the US say, oh my gosh, if I now use my nuclear weapons in Europe, then this will imply that Russia will regard the US as a combatant country using nuclear weapons. And for that reason, I will give Russia a reason to retaliate by using yet another nuclear weapon, not only against Europe, but maybe even against the US, which would, of course, be the first event of this kind in history, because so far the US, because of its insular position, geographically speaking, has never had a war on its territory while Europe was in World War I and World War II. So I think this is one of the reasons why it is very, very difficult for the Russian side to actually take to this action. But on the other hand, everyone who seems to know Russia better than I tells me that Russia is very restrained for a very long period of time, watching the other side crossing one red line after the other. And then suddenly something very, very bad might happen. So this is also something we should have at the back of our mind and which should be assessed appropriately in all these ideas about what might happen when.
And we do see the escalation ladder kind of slowly going up because, Ukraine is attacking more and more often into Russian territory and attacking the energy, attacking shipping. Civilian casualties are growing on the Russian side. So you're quite right. It's a question of seeing how long the Russians say enough is enough. Many experts are saying that the US would in fact not retaliate. But of course, I am not an expert in military strategy, but they think that the US would not retaliate and the West would back down. But of course, this is all speculation. As you said, this would be uncharted waters if it would escalate to a nuclear extent.
I think there are many people who think that if anything happens in the NATO part of Europe, then the US cannot but intervene. Maybe not by its nuclear weapons, but by other forms of intervention. So if you speak to people from the military, if you speak to journalists, if you speak to politicians, their basic assumption is that they can actually walk up the escalation ladder, because if it comes to the point that Russia actually finally loses its temper and starts attacking NATO, then the US will always be on the European side. This gives them a kind of security, which actually also is the reason why they think they can escalate and they can allow for Ukraine to use weapons that are being paid for or even made in European countries to walk up the escalation ladder. And there are other people who say, you know what, the US will very much shy away from intervening into such a war because from a US point of view, at least under the current administration, they are not interested in this war in Ukraine anymore. If they intervened, this would mean that they would come into a very similar situation as they are confronted with in the Near East at this moment. They joined the war because Israel wanted them to join the war, and Israel convinced them that Israel needed US support in order to reach its aim in Iran. So if the Europeans walk up the escalation ladder, they draw the US into a war that the US actually doesn't want. So this is one of the reasons why people say, and I must say that I actually agree to this assessment, that the probability that the US is going to intervene is comparatively low. So this does not imply that in a situation of a all-out war between the western part of Europe, organized in NATO and in the EU, and Russia, that in the event of such a war, the US would not give the kind of support it also gives to Ukraine at this moment, for example, intelligence, weapons, and things like this. But I do not think that the US would dare to intervene directly because of this basic assessment of the situation, which says one should avoid, no matter whether they actually are in a conventional war or in a nuclear war, one should avoid any kind of war between two nuclear great powers. And if we look at the situation in East Asia just for a moment, we'll see that when Donald Trump visited Xi Jinping in May this year, Xi Jinping told him, you know what, if we are going to have a war between Taiwan and mainland China, you do not have the right to decide whether or not you intervene because you will be part of this war immediately, which implies that Xi Jinping was telling him you should never think about supporting any moves on the side of Taiwan towards declaring independence, because that will be the start of a war against Taiwan. And in this war, you will be forced by us, China, to actually be part of this war, right? And in this situation, Donald Trump backed off and said, ooh, this is not what we want. And I think this also shows that the US is very aware of the inherent risk of going to war directly against either Russia or China. And for that reason, I think that the probability that the US is going to intervene in such a war is very low, and that it is a miscalculation on the European side to rely on this potential support by the US. If you look at Taiwan, Taiwan is actually trying to walk up the escalation ladder, so far only by making more and more utterances that come very close to declaring independence. So far thought that they can walk up the escalation ladder because they thought that the US would definitely intervene. I always said the US is not going to do this. Why? Because then the US would have to go into a direct war with China, and they don't want this, right? So very, very interestingly, the miscalculation on a potential US support is the reason why actors such as EU Europe and such as Taiwan and such as Ukraine think they can walk up the escalation ladder. I think this is a miscalculation. You can think that you can preserve this miscalculation because it serves you propagating a certain narrative about your position in the system of international relations. For that reason, our politicians don't speak about this risk. Maybe they know, but they don't tell us.
And you would think that European leaders would have maybe learned the lessons that Israel has now learned. And let us not forget that one could argue, but I would say Israel is maybe the closest ally of the United States, even closer than Europe, if you want to take Europe as a whole. And now we see how Donald Trump decided that he can no longer sustain this war with Iran, and he came to a deal with Iran. And we all know what's happening in Israel now. They are incredibly unhappy with this peace deal and are doing their very best to sabotage it. But the Europeans seem to have blinders on, thinking, oh no, we're even more special than Israel, which I don't think anyone in Europe could argue that, because there is this really special relationship between the United States and Israel. So it's really strange how they cannot learn from how the US has acted in the Middle East with its war, where it actually was a party, but has now decided to walk away and leave its closest ally in the lurch. But the Europeans think, oh, if walk up the escalation ladder, the United States is going to join the war on Ukraine's side, and we can achieve all our goals. And if we just go back before Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, the West, especially Europe, also the United States, was downgrading Russia from the ranks of a great power. And they have this great hatred of Russia, which was encouraged by the EU and the US. And I have to say, the Western mainstream media have played a very significant role in this negative perception of Russia even before they invaded Ukraine. So what has happened between Western thinking during the Cold War and Western thinking today? Why has Russia become this enemy number one? And it has this also to do with a world order shifting from unipolarity to multipolarity.
Definitely. I think we really have to understand that this enormous hatred of Russia has its very, very deep historical roots. And on the other hand, Russia's, I would say sometimes even hatred, especially when they talk about the western part of Europe, including especially France and the United Kingdom, has also its very, very deep historical roots. It's not so much the situation of the Cold War we actually have to have in mind. And I think when Russian politicians talk about this situation, they actually go back to the Napoleon Wars, right? Whereas when the Western European politicians go back in history, they don't even go back to World War II, when the US and the UK and Russia, or at the time the Soviet Union, were jointly fighting against Germany. What I would like for everybody to understand is that this historically accumulated love or hatred for a certain country is constant, whereas the use of this love or hatred for a certain country has to meet certain conditions. So if we need the hatred, we will refer to the hatred. If we don't need the hatred, we will forget about it. And so the problem that we actually have in this situation is a structural problem of how certain nations in Europe want to become stronger and how other nations need to be downgraded in order for the one nation that wants to become stronger to actually look stronger. And this is always something that happens on both sides of the conflict. Very interestingly. I mean, when you hear some Russian politicians speaking about Western Europe, it sounds terrible because they are much more outspoken about the hatred side of their feelings, right? And if you hear certain politicians from Western Europe talking about Russia, you feel, how was it possible for us to survive the Cold War and for hot war never to break out during the Cold War period, at least in Europe? I think that when we look at the US and its relationship to Western Europe, especially Germany, we'll see that the US actually wants to walk away from the war, but it does not really want to end the war in Ukraine. So if the US really wanted to end the war in Ukraine, they would, for example, not provide intelligence to Ukraine anymore, which would make it enormously difficult for the Ukraine to hit all those targets in the Russian motherland. And for that reason, the situation would be totally different. So the US actually wants to walk away from the war, but it does not necessarily want the war to end. Why? Because from a US point of view, the war in Ukraine has many advantages. So one advantage is that because of the war in Ukraine, the European economy is in ruins, not because we are being hit by any weapons from Russia, but because we don't have people, longing to invest in our countries because they anticipate that maybe there will be war even in the western part of Europe. So why should I invest at this moment and then maybe be the victim with my new investment of a potential war going on or breaking out? So, there are many, many reasons why the malaise of the European economy is related to the fact that we are in a covered war with Russia, and we have been in this covered war with Russia for a long time. And this covered war has the potential of developing into an overt war. So for the US to control its competitors, its economically most potent competitors, the war in Ukraine is a very, very good instrument of having the European economy run low. This is one of many reasons why the US is quite interested in not ending the war, but at the same time is interested in walking away from the war. And with regard to Israel and the capacity of Europe to learn from the situation Israel is in at this moment, I think we do see a certain tendency, but this tendency is very interesting. It is not a de-escalation tendency. It's a tendency to say, under the given conditions, which implies that the US is actually trying to strike a deal with Iran without having Israel and its specific interests in this war incorporated in its deliberations about a potential peace with Iran, European politicians now criticize the US much more openly than maybe a week ago. And at the same time, they directly or indirectly back Israel much more than a week ago. So this is the way how they learn from Israel's situation. And they think they're very courageous and brave in distancing themselves from the US and at the same time supporting Israel even more than in the past, because they think that now with the US walking away from the war in the Near East, Israel needs the support just as much as Ukraine needs the support. This is how the logic of European politicians seem to work at this moment.
That just doesn't seem logical at all, if you want to use the word logic with regard to this reaction. Let us stay in Europe and European politicians. We just had the G7 summit from June 15th, and it's ending today, June 17th in France. And of course, all the leaders there wanted to focus attention on the war in Ukraine, which fell, of course, off President Trump's radar after the war started with Iran. And on Tuesday, President Trump dashed those hopes to focus on Ukraine. He made clear at the summit that the Ukraine conflict was no longer high on his priority list, to the great surprise of everyone. And let us take a moment to remember that it was President Trump who said that he was going to end the war within 24 hours after taking office. We all know that that didn't happen. The G7 summit, he said, and I quote, "Look, we have nothing to do with it. It has no impact on us other than we sell weapons to Ukraine." And he went on to say, "We're thousands of miles away." This doesn't seem like new news to people who actually have been following President Trump's statements. As you already said at the beginning of our discussion, the U.S. has made very clear that they're walking away from this war in Ukraine and don't want to become directly involved. The U.S. has and will continue to retreat from Ukraine, but Europeans seem to be surprised every time President Trump says this. So in this connection, what is the future of the NATO alliance now that the U.S. is pivoting towards East Asia and the war in Iran is winding down? And can or will Europe fill the gap that the U.S. is leaving behind regarding security in Europe?
I'm very doubtful about this. And although I hear people from the military saying that, if you combine the forces of the different European countries, you will see that Europe is very well equipped, even if it comes to war between Russia and the western part of Europe. But I actually am very doubtful that a NATO with an uninterested hegemon, which is the US, can actually act up to its potential. So from the point of view of capabilities, I think we have lots of weapons and all this kind of thing. Maybe not enough, but we do have lots of weapons if you count the number of airplanes and things like this. But what we lack is actually the coordinating function of the US. And so far, the US has played an enormously important role in coordinating the different NATO member states into combined action. And this is, of course, also a capability that the US has and very much monopolizes. I'm doubtful about NATO being able to work up to its potential if we lose the coordinating function of the US. And when we talk about rearmament, when we talk of the upgrading of armies in Europe, I think people who are more specialized in military affairs than I am tell me that they think it will take at least up to 10 years until the European part of NATO will have rearmed and reorganized itself so that it can actually be active without US coordination. And I think this is also something that the US knows very well, whereas the European public is not informed about this constellation. And I think that many politicians in Europe underestimate the enormous transformation that Europe will have to undergo if the uninterested hegemon actually tells them bye-bye, at least to a certain degree. And I don't think that the US is going to say bye-bye within the next months, and it will take quite a long time to reorganize the whole situation. And even under the leadership of Donald Trump, I would suggest that the US is trying to reach its aims in a comparatively responsible manner. But I don't think the way European politicians seem to be insisting that they cannot imagine for the US to retreat from Europe. I think this is wishful thinking, and we should prepare for worst times to come.
But the US has made really clear, and Donald Trump repeated it at the G7 meeting. He said that Russia should make a deal. You know, it's time to talk, stop waging war, come to the table and make a deal and stop this war. And he frames the US involvement in Ukraine more as a humanitarian mission to protect an ally, always citing the number of casualties both in Ukraine and Russia. And that's why he wants to bring it to a close. And of course, Volodymyr Zelensky was really pushing at the G7 meeting. And there was this short meeting between Zelensky, Trump, and Macron. I think it lasted about 30 minutes in Evian. And Zelensky wanted to push the White House and Donald Trump into setting up the trilateral negotiations between US, Ukraine, and Russia again. But the US has made very clear that they're not interested in becoming involved in this anymore. They did try to do this in the past. So do you see this peace process moving forward at all without U.S. involvement? Because it doesn't look like the Europeans have any clue, as we already discussed. And it seems like the European leaders are really gaslighting the public.
The U.S. is in a precarious situation because they know very well that if they come to a deal with Russia, then they will have Ukraine and the European nations supporting Ukraine not complying with the deal. It's the exact same situation as in the Near East. The US talks to Iran, does not include Israel. It comes to a certain vague conclusion, in a deal of some kind with Iran. But we see that Israel is unhappy about the situation. Structurally speaking, Israel must be against a deal between the US and Iran. And of course, they are. The same situation is going to take place in Europe. And obviously, Donald Trump is no longer interested in creating this exact same conundrum that he has just created in Iran for the European situation. On the other hand, I think that so far, the European nations under Brussels leadership have no idea how to actually find a way to end this war. First of all, they are quite interested in having this war go on because they think that as long as Russia is in a war with Ukraine, Russia will not attack any other EU member states or NATO member states. Having the war go on is, from a military point of view, quite a rational solution for those countries that are only indirectly involved in this war. And secondly, we just talked about this, they need this war to make it clear to every one of us that Russia is our main enemy. And this plays a very important role in keeping the EU together. So for the EU, it's not really interested in ending the war. And because they're not interested in ending the war, they're not making any plans to end the war. Right. And this goes along with the fact that, for example, we don't hear anything about the casualties of the Ukrainian army in the battlefield. We only hear of enormous numbers of casualties from the Russian side. We are made to believe that Ukraine can win the war because of its advanced drone techniques. And by hitting industrially important places in Russia, they will finally make Russia develop into a situation where its economy simply cannot sustain anymore with the war going on. So this is their calculation. And they think that if they can support Ukraine in this war, eventually Russia will lose the war because of its economy being unable to sustain the situation. And because if the economy cannot sustain anymore, then they will also have political problems inside the elites. And then everything will be just wonderful because the EU and the European part of NATO will have actually reached its aims. And this can go on for years and years and years and years. And they think that they can actually sustain the situation economically, although all EU countries are in very bad shape with regard to their economy. This is their calculation. And for that reason, I think they somewhat have to overlook the US factor. So I repeat myself by saying the moment Donald Trump gets really fed up with the situation in Europe because of one reason or the other, he will stop providing intelligence to Ukraine. And then the situation will be very, very difficult because, as far as I know, the Europeans also provide intelligence, but the level of sophistication is much lower. So especially the part of the war that relates to hitting targets in Mother Russia, this part will then be very, very difficult for the EU European countries to take over. The European politicians have to repeat that, of course, the US is on their side, because they say if the US were not on our side, they would not provide intelligence to Ukraine anymore. So Donald Trump can speak and say, we are not interested in this war anymore. But they think that this non-interest will never reach the point where US stops providing intelligence.
But let us not forget that the US already stopped providing intelligence for a short period. I believe it was it last summer for a number of days. And that was an absolute catastrophe for Ukraine. And what does Ukraine also need to wage a war is fighters. And now they have just announced that they want to have half of their fighting military be mercenaries. And of course, what do you need if you want to pay all these mercenaries? You need money. And the G7 Extraordinary Revenue Acceleration Loan provides Ukraine with approximately 15 billion in financial backing. These loans are serviced and repaid using future interest and windfall profits generated by the roughly 300 billion in immobilized Russian sovereign assets held primarily in Western financial institutions. The fate of these assets is central to any peace deal between Russia and Ukraine. In addition, the EU has passed 21 sanction packages against Russia, the latest package targeting Russian energy revenues, its military-industrial complex, propaganda, and human rights violation. So let us not forget that this is the same EU that has failed to reach an agreement on sanctioning Israel's far-right wing Ben Gvir. Israel's sovereign assets in the EU are not frozen, and Israel has not been made to pay for the reconstruction of Gaza, Lebanon, or Iran. And the EU has yet not come to an agreement on suspending the EU-Israel Association Agreement, which would be a big blow for it. Russia, on the other hand, profits strategically and economically from this global double standard, which is so blatant, by exploiting geopolitical hypocrisies such as Western nations criticizing energy purchases while simultaneously trading in Russian liquefied natural gas or importing Russian crude oil. Moscow secures steady revenues to sustain its wartime economy and finance its war against Ukraine. And of course, the war in Iran also exacerbated the situation. And Trump, we know, lifted partially the sanctions on Russian oil, which he then now says he wants to reinstate, although we don't know when he wants to reinstate them. Russia is actively exploiting these accusations of Western hypocrisy to build relationships with non-aligned countries, but has this double standard that the EU has so blatantly displayed not backfired, giving Russia a justification for its foreign policy actions? And is the EU public not fed up with being gaslighted all the time?
Well, let me first refer to the first part of what you just gave us in form of very, very interesting information. So I think, if we try to analyze why are the European countries not interested in ending the war in Ukraine, you just gave us yet another very important argument. As they are drawing onto the frozen assets and the interest they get from this, they actually are very interested in not bringing the situation to an end, because once the war would have come to an end without the Russian Federation undergoing regime change and capitulating, this would mean that, of course, everything the EU has done with regard to frozen assets of the Russian Federation will be brought to court. And it has a very high probability that the courts will rule against the EU. And for that reason, they also have to prolong this, right? Because only if the war goes on can they draw onto these assets. And I think this is very, very interesting. With regard to double standards, my feeling is that the majority of people I talk to on this issue are not interested in this double standard narratives anymore. Why are they not interested? Because they see that politicians around the world, including those in Brussels, are actually now in a situation where they have to leave their value-laden narratives about foreign policy, which they told us in the past, to a very realistic assessment of the situation. At least their selective way of talking about the international situation has more of a realist drive behind it. So people are very pragmatic nowadays. I think much more pragmatic than politicians sometimes are. They see the situation and they say, how can we survive in such a delicate situation? And for that reason, I think the double standard thing is typically an argument that comes from people who have not realized that we are living in a highly dangerous world in which one false move can lead the world into catastrophe. And these are usually people who are still very much on the value side of foreign policy and who are not so familiar with or who have reasons not to move over to the realist side of looking at the international situation. If you look at the situation among European politicians regarding its support to Israel and its hatred of Russia, I think we actually do not need to revert to this double standard narrative. We can look at it from a very realist point of view. And the very realist point of view is Russia is threatening us according to the assessment of these politicians, whereas Israel is not threatening us. So supporting Israel up until recently meant that we are not running into a conflict with the US. So EU-Europe is always willing to do things that make Europe look good and at the same time not create any conflicts with the US. Now they are in a new situation. And I would say with the start of the war in Iran, European politicians become more and more nervous about this constellation because they are intelligent enough to anticipate that sooner or later conflicts between the US and Israel will arise. And in that situation, they will come into a very precarious constellation, which is difficult for them to handle. But because Israel is not threatening us, so it's very easy to support Israel. Of course, this implies that if we support Israel, we'll lose quite a number of countries that do not want to support Israel. And the other day we talked about Germany losing the elections in the United Nations for the non-permanent membership of the United Nations Security Council. And Germany actually provided the argument saying that because of its support for Israel, it actually did not have the support of many other countries. And although I, in our conversation at the time, downgraded this and said this is narrative that Germany wants to provide us with because it doesn't really want to talk about other reasons why maybe countries are not so happy about Germany, that they would cast a vote in favor of Germany being part of the United Nations Security Council. I think it does play a certain role. And if I try to understand why European politicians are not so concerned about this situation, I would think that they still think that economically speaking, they are so potent that even though these countries are politically maybe unhappy about the pro-Israel stance of the European Union, they cannot disrupt their relationship with the European Union because they would lose too much. I think that the European Union is very slow in understanding how fast our world is changing and how fast countries that are not happy with EU collaboration anymore can actually move towards other big actors in the world. At this moment, one of the reasons why the EU is very slow in understanding this situation is because they're actually signing quite a lot of contracts for trade, collaboration with this and that region of the world. And I think when they talk amongst each other, they will always refer to these enormous successes. During the last months, they signed many of these contracts. And because of that reason, I think they console themselves and say, see how Latin America, how Africa, Indonesia, everybody is so interested in collaborating with the EU that we don't see any negative consequences from our political attitude towards Israel yet.
You mentioned Germany. Germany has been making waves lately. It's very serious about building up its military. It wants to have the largest standing army in Europe. This is not only upsetting the Russians, but also I think Great Britain and France maybe not too happy about statements like that. Germany does not have nuclear weapons. There are U.S. weapons stationed on German soil. At what point do you think Germany might want to get its own nuclear weapon? If Russia keeps talking about using nuclear weapons, or would Russia actually have to use a nuclear weapon for Germany to say, okay, this does it, I want my own nuclear weapon? And wouldn't that be the beginning of the end of the NPT, and there would be a new wave of nuclear proliferation around the globe? We already discussed this in previous podcasts regarding Iran maybe wanting a bomb now just for deterrence reasons. Would Russia even allow a German nuclear bomb? And where does that leave European security and NATO? If Germany gets a nuclear bomb, Japan, of course, would also want to get one, and that would be totally against what China would like. And we would just be living in a more and more dangerous world. And as you say, anything could then set off a huge war.
I think it is, structurally speaking, quite natural to assume that both Germany and Japan are in a position where they might think they need a nuclear bomb. And in Japan, interestingly, this discussion is a very open discussion. You can read it in their newspapers. You can listen to their TV. They actually speak quite openly about this. They have a prime minister who is quite hawkish. And because she wants to show how strong she is, she actually dares to address these issues quite openly. In Germany, I think there's also some discussion about this development, but I think in both cases, this is only a 1B solution and not a 1A solution. So both countries actually are pursuing the same kind of strategy. According to the US National Security Strategy of November 2025, the US wants the regions to actually solve its regional conflicts by regional means. This seems like a very unexpected diversion from earlier policies on the side of the US, when the US always tried to avoid that any region could develop the capacity to solve its problems by itself. It always wanted to make sure that if there is a regional conflict, the US has to come as the savior of the region and provide the solution and provide the means to solve the problem, or to leave the problem unsolved, to change it into a frozen conflict. And in this frozen conflict, the US would always be present. As a matter of fact, I think the change in policy is not as big as one might believe it to be, because according to what Japan does at this moment and what Germany does at this moment, I think we can understand how they interpret this new policy. And I think that the US, if you ask official interpreters of its own national security strategy, they would actually consent to the interpretation inherently given by Germany and by Japan. And this interpretation is, if we have a regional conflict, then the country that is closest to the US acts as a proxy for the US in bringing this conflict to a whatsoever close. And by doing this, it simultaneously qualifies as the closest ally to the US and as the most powerful country in the region. So Germany is trying to overcome certain deficiency it has in claiming leadership for Europe. For example, it doesn't have nuclear weapons, by pursuing this kind of policy. I do what the US wants in my region, and in this particular moment, this implies that I am the most powerful supporter of Ukraine. They think that they need to show to everybody that Germany is the most powerful supporter of Ukraine. And by being the most powerful supporter of Ukraine, you qualify as the closest ally to the US. And at the same time, you qualify among the European nations as the one nation that is more equal than all the other EU members. The same is true for Japan. Japan says, we are going to support Taiwan in case of a military assault from the mainland. And by saying this, they show the US, you know what? you do not need to interfere directly because we are going to interfere on your behalf. So please take us as the most reliant ally you have in the region. And at the same time, they signal to the region that they think they are potent enough to actually fight against China. And by declaring their support to Taiwan, they want all the nations in the region to align with Japan and show that they take Japan as the one and only country in East Asia that can fight against China, not only contain China, but even fight against China. And this is the exact same policy that Germany is pursuing in Europe. And now they are in this terrible situation that because of the US participating in the war and the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, the US is actually pursuing a policy that is very much to the detriment of Japanese and German interests. And so when you listen to government officials or politicians from the CDU in Germany, you hear that they are now distancing themselves more and more from the US. And their equation that if they support Ukraine, they will be regarded by the US as their closest ally in Europe doesn't work anymore, especially when Donald Trump reiterates time and again that he's not interested in the war in Ukraine anymore. So this shows that the politicians in Germany have a strategy of acting as the leading nation in Europe, both economically and militarily, but the foundation on which they built their policy is no longer existing. They are, I think, pursuing a policy that has no relationship to reality anymore. And this is usually a policy that will be utterly unsuccessful. And the same is true, I think, for Japan. Japan is overestimating its capacities in trying to really go against China. And I think they will see that both economically and militarily, they cannot work up to their own expectations. And the other day, Donald Trump informed the German government and the Japanese government that the US cannot supply Tomahawks for both countries. And of course, this is only a problem of supply chain. No, it's not. He was giving a signal saying, you know what? I don't want you to be so hawkish. Very interesting.
Yeah, very. And something else which somehow has been flying under the radar, also because the war in Iran was headline news for the past months, is the expiration of the New START Treaty, which expired on February 5 and has left the world without any binding legal caps on the US and Russian strategic nuclear arsenals for the first time since 1972. This ends half a century of traditional bilateral arms control in pushing global security into an unpredictable new era. And the loss of this agreement means not only the end of mutual on-site inspections, data exchanges, and the stabilizing guardrails that previously prevented rapid worst-case nuclear buildups, as well as ending limits on deployed warheads and delivery systems. And unlike the Cold War, this renewed competition is far more complex and has turned into a trilateral strategic competition between China, Russia, and the US. Without any transparency mechanism, now that New START has expired, and an arms race, the threat of a nuclear escalation has become even more serious. NATO has become emboldened by arming Ukraine, especially the European side of NATO, as we've been discussing. They've been throwing offensive and even more lethal weapons. Now you mentioned Donald Trump, who says, sorry, no more Tomahawks, which is an offensive weapon, and trying to give us a hint, stop attacking Russia on its soil. So with New START gone, how will this affect a Russia-Ukraine war? Will it escalate the war even further, in your opinion?
Well, I think the current situation with regards to the proliferation of nuclear weapons, which is a situation you already hinted at in your previous question, I think is really very dangerous, but we will be confronted with a totally new situation within the next years to come. And I think one of the reasons why we will actually have to take a massive proliferation of nuclear weapons into account is the fact that we are undergoing a change of the international system towards what is usually called a multipolar system. So at this moment, it is not clear which countries of the world can actually qualify to be a pole in this multipolar world. And unfortunately, I think that there are quite a number of countries that calculate if they had nuclear weapons, they would qualify for a pole position in this multipolar world. And for that reason, there is a lot of incentive to develop nuclear weapons, not because you really want to use them in a wartime situation, but you want to use them to show your potential, to show your power, and to qualify as a nuclear power and thus qualify as a pole in a multipolar world. Why does Japan think about having their own nuclear weapons? It's also because they see that in Asia, there are at least two competitors for a pole position. One is China, one is India, right? And Japan has to show, although it's much smaller than China and India, that it wants to occupy a pole position. This is one of the incentives driving countries that don't really want to use the weapon in times of war, but that want to use the weapon to show that they have a potential of becoming a pole. And this is a totally new situation. If you look at the Cold War situation, we had these two countries, the United States and the USSR, possessing nuclear weapons. Then China was put into a position, first by the USSR, to develop its own nuclear weapons. It is interesting that Khrushchev actually provided the technology to China to develop a nuclear weapon in a situation where he wanted to elevate China to a position of world power, because he wanted to have a triangular situation rather than a bipolar situation. And for that reason, starting from 1954 until 1960, the USSR was investing heavily into the industrialization of China, and at the same time was providing technological support to China to develop its own nuclear weapon. And by this, they thought that they could elevate China to a world power position, because both in terms of its economy and in terms of its military capacity, it would have reached a level that the other big power, the US, could acknowledge as being on a world power level. And so we can see that this nuclear weapon issue is not only an issue of war and peace, it's also an issue of how much power can I project to everybody else by having this weapon. And I think the second reason why we will see a proliferation of nuclear weapons is because so many countries that were too poor and technologically not developed enough to develop a nuclear weapon have now reached the level where they could actually think about developing a nuclear weapon, because they fear that some other power will calculate on regime changes in these respective countries, because they need this country as part of their sphere of influence. And for that reason, I think countries will learn from North Korea that if you have nuclear weapons, then no other country dares to try and induce regime change. It's quite interesting that we are not afraid of trying to pursue a policy of regime change in Russia, despite the fact that it has 6,500 nuclear warheads. Whereas we are afraid of inducing regime change in North Korea because they have a limited nuclear capacity. This is very paradoxical. A small country having a limited nuclear capacity, but willing to use it so that no regime change will happen in their country, is looked upon as being much more dangerous with regard to their nuclear potential than a country like Russia that has 6,500 nuclear warheads. Very paradoxical situation. Very paradoxical situation. And this situation shows us that more and more countries that are small but afraid of regime change will actually try to buy or develop the technology or to use some other small country as a nuclear umbrella. You see, for example, the relationship between Pakistan and Saudi Arabia at this point, where Pakistan said, okay, I'm providing my nuclear umbrella to you. Very interesting. Nobody would have thought of a possibility like this a few years ago, but this is reality now. And I think this kind of reality is going to spread. And the monopoly on nuclear weapons by those countries that do not want to go to war against each other is going to be non-existent within the next 10 years.
Yeah, very interesting that North Korea has a working nuclear deterrent protecting its regime, whereas Russia, with the largest nuclear arsenal in the world, the Europeans seem to be suffering from amnesia here and attacking Russia through Ukraine all the time with even more serious weaponry. And of course, we all know the US and Israel have killed and threatened to kill sovereign leaders for many decades now. But not only the nuclear issue and the nuclear escalation, which we've been talking about, is playing a major role in warfare. There is the drone revolution, which was brought about first with the war in Ukraine and now Israel's genocide in Gaza and killing civilians in Lebanon, Syria, and Iran. These drones are playing a major role in this new warfare. And of course, drones are much cheaper to produce. And it enables a new war of mass destruction where actually everyone can be a target and they're easy to produce as well. This has allowed the military industrial complex to develop these new lethal technologies and test them on live human beings in these war theaters, which is a really horrible, horrible thing. But that's what's been going on in Ukraine and in the Middle East. The Israelis have a really large military industrial complex and have been testing their weapons on the Palestinians, for instance, and now they're testing them on the Lebanese. So the international rule-based order is breaking down also regards to laws of war because no longer are civilians protected, no longer do prisoners of wars have any rights. Targets are found by artificial intelligence, then you have robotic dogs which hunt humans on the battlefield. And one has to say that the EU has played a significant role in the development of these technologies by funding Israeli weapons companies. And also, which is a topic we discussed, by undermining the international rules-based order. So are there no more rules of warfare? Is this the brave new world we are living in? And this too could lead to a world war, for instance. An escalation is happening as we speak in the Ukraine war, using these drones.
Yeah, the drone factor is really, really interesting, and it produces new ways of looking at war on a daily basis. The other day, I listened to an interview by the mayor of a small place in Bavaria who had to decide whether or not to allow for an industrial plant to be located on his territory that produces drones. And he said something very interesting. He said, I have small children, and they will eventually, if we go to war against any other country, they will be drawn into this war and they will have to act as soldiers. So when I imagine that they can guide drones rather than sitting in the trenches and trying to kill yet another soldier or being killed by yet another soldier, I think that imagining my children sitting someplace very, very safe from where they can guide a drone gives me a very good feeling. So this implies that this drone war also makes the threshold lower when I can enter the war because people calculate that they will not be harmed. So it's very, very interesting to see that the way Russia pursues its war against Ukraine has so far not produced enormously high numbers of civilian victims. I'm not saying that I don't feel for these people who lose their siblings and who lose their lives, but realistically speaking, one could say that the fact that this war has been going on for such a long time and it has killed many, many soldiers, in comparison, it has not killed as many civilians as we might have expected. And I think this shows that, for example, in former times, one of the reasons why you had to end a war was because the civilian losses were extremely high. The second very important issue is, of course, that your economy could not sustain the situation anymore. And so the human factor played a very important role in forcing the leadership of a certain country that was going to war against another country or other countries into ending this war. The human factor was really, really important. And this starts with the 30-year war, although it was a 30-year war and had many, many casualties. But finally, it was the human factor that convinced the politicians of the time that they had to end this war. And this is, of course, also true for World War I and World War II. So if the human factor doesn't play a role as big as in the past, we might come to realize that politicians will opt in favor of going to war much earlier than in the past because the risk they are running is lower. So what kind of risk would they be running? The risk is when you go to war against some other country, no matter whether you will eventually turn out to be the winner or the loser, you will always have to calculate that the population that is somewhat backing you and that you need to participate actively in your war will come to a point where it says, you know what, we don't support you anymore, right? But if you don't need them as much as in the past, then you don't need to calculate. And the politician comes and the population comes to the wrong assessment that they can actually go to war against some other country without being harmed by this war. This story is also something that Ukraine is trying to destroy with regard to Russia. It shows the Russian population that this war is not a war that only goes on Ukraine territory. It also hits the population of Russia. And this is because they know that if the population no longer supports its leadership, then the leadership will have enormous difficulties in going on with this war. It is quite interesting to see that our politicians now want to invest a lot into making this war a war of technology in which the human factor is reduced to sitting in a bomb shelter someplace and guiding the missiles and guiding the airplanes and guiding the drones from a remote place where they cannot be hit, so that they are not threatened as much as in past wars with their life. And this is, of course, a situation which is new and which makes all the calculations that we as a population and our politicians will have to make. And we have to learn from the situation that what we are encountering at this moment is a gradual lowering of the threshold of when to take the decision to go to war and when to take the decision to use nuclear weapons in war.
Yeah, but I don't agree with that statement that that German mayor made, because as the example of Gaza shows us, maybe the person operating the drone is safe in his little bunker, but in effect, using drones and AI, artificial intelligence, for warfare makes everyone a target. And that's why we have 80,000 people killed in Gaza, most of which are not Hamas. Most of them are actually women and children. So if you want to take that as an example of future warfare, it's really scary. And you're right. I mean, it's easier to press a button than to have to shoot somebody because it looks like a video game. But at the end of the day, actually, everyone is a target, which you see now in Gaza, for instance, or in Lebanon, right, where you can see entire regions that have just been flattened, and they use drones also to do that. And by the way, Israel also is using white phosphorus in Lebanon as well, which is a forbidden substance. So it just seems like there are no rules of warfare anymore. So I do hope that that German town decides not to build the drone factory, but I'm not very hopeful regarding that.
If we compare the kind of war I was talking about with the kind of war you were talking about, we can, I think, learn that, of course, the aim you pursue with your war defines the kind of weapons and the kind of strategy you use. So with regard to what we are observing in Gaza and in Lebanon, I think it is quite clear that the Israel army wanted to drive out the population from those parts of Gaza that it actually claims for itself. So in order to drive out the population, you actually have to fight against civilians and you have to purposely hit civilians. They thought that if they do this, then the population will actually flee, and so they will have reached their aim without killing so many people. But as the other side of the conflict realized that the population was actually the target here, they, of course, tried to convince the population not to flee at the will of the Israeli army. And for that reason, so many civilians had to die in this Gaza war. This is my understanding of the situation. Whereas in the case of the war in Ukraine, Russia actually does not have the aim of to pursue a depopulation of the territory. They do not have civilians as their main target because they regard the Ukrainian population as their brother nation, and therefore have enormous difficulties in arguing we throw a nuclear bomb on Ukraine and then everything will be over, because then this brother nation will be hit by a nuclear weapon and will be very much destroyed. So there are different strategic aims here, and these different strategic aims actually generate different strategies. And you're totally right in criticizing this mayor of this little place in Bavaria, because he, of course, calculates that if he has an industrial plant producing drones, he might be the target of an attack in a future technology-driven war. Because in a technology-driven war, you want to destroy the capacity of your adversary to produce arms. He thinks that this is minor in comparison to a war that is closer to what we have been observing in Gaza, where actually the individual soldier on both sides, including the civilians, still play an enormously big role. We can learn from comparing these two different kinds of wars that the technology-driven war does not exclude other wars that are human beings driven. And you alluded to those robots that can carry weapons and things like this. This is how countries try to avoid putting too much human investment into war and replace soldiers by these kind of robots. But so far, we have not seen yet that in a war in which robots already play a certain role, they totally replace the soldiers as human beings, having to fight against other human beings and against the civilian population.
The scary part is the victims in Gaza, and you correctly made a difference between the goals of the Israelis to just eliminate all Palestinians from Gaza, whereas, of course, the Russians do not have that goal regarding Ukraine at all, which is why we see the difference in the civilian casualties. But let us not forget, there are rules of war, and those rules of war just don't apply anymore. And the rules of war say you cannot target civilian targets, right? So what Israel has done in Gaza is absolutely against these rules of war, which we have set up as an international community, and they've just been thrown out of the window. When we think of a war, we think of one army facing another army. We don't think of an army with high-level technology drones and military targeting families, children, and elderly. That just is not what we think of as a war in
but
our
this
present
is a wrong
age.
perception of war, I must tell you. Because if you look into the history of war, you can see no war that did not make harm to civilians. And especially when the war draws to its end, and you can see this very clearly during World War II, both in Japan and Germany, the war finally came to an end when the Allies started drawing civilians very heavily into the war theater and bombing, for example, big cities like Tokyo and Dresden and Berlin and whatsoever. So I think the perception that two armies are confronting each other is a perception from the Middle Ages, actually, when we really had two armies fighting against each other and every single soldier of this one army fighting against every potential soldier in the other army. But I think starting with modern warfare, we have always seen phases of war when nobody complied with the rules for war anymore. Look at the war in Vietnam. The war in Vietnam was a war that heavily affected civilians, and on both sides, they did not comply with the rules that were set for a civilized war. So once we come to the point of actually going to war against each other, the possibility to stick to these rules lowers very quickly. And you will always argue that I need to do something that I'm not supposed to be doing because I can avoid more casualties. I can avoid this war to go on as a forever war. Just think about the US throwing a nuclear bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in a situation about which most researchers today would say it was not necessary to throw these bombs anymore. But they did it. And what did they tell us? This is absolutely necessary to avoid thousands and thousands and thousands of casualties on the side of the American army. And for that reason, we had to bomb them into unconditional surrender. The Japanese side had already decided that they would go for the unconditional surrender option, and they were only negotiating with the US what an unconditional surrender actually had to look like. So it's very interesting to see that under certain conditions, in certain phases of the war, we have to know that the parties that are in war against each other will not comply with the rules of the game.
Yes, you're right, but that doesn't make it any better. And the US didn't have to throw those bombs. And many say that they did this just to show Russia that they had these bombs. As my final questions, I wanted to turn now to the Baltic states, Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia, which remember the Soviet rule and have a great fear of Russia. They have incredibly increased their defense budgets. They're very small states and they spend a huge amount on defense. And lately, a series of suspected Ukrainian drones have veered off course and entered their airspace, so have entered Baltic airspace.
Yeah.
In mid-May, 2 drone incidents within 48 hours of each other rattled the region, and a Romanian NATO jet fighter had to scramble in response to the incursion, while Lithuania issued a public alert urging residents and its parliament to seek shelter during another such event. So Ukraine is blaming Moscow for changing the drone flight path. Both sides agreed that they were Ukrainian drones and not Russian drones. But my question is Ukraine trying to provoke a war between NATO and Russia by doing things like this? Because why would Ukraine send a drone there unless it's trying to provoke a war? Could this mean even more danger for us in Europe, that a escalation would take place?
From Ukraine's point of view, if they want to win the war, they have to drag NATO into the war. They will not be able to win the war just by going on and on and on and on. So it is quite clear that from a Ukrainian point of view, the participation of NATO in this war would be, according to their assessment, preferable. They think they can win the war if they have not only the indirect backing of NATO, but the direct participation of NATO. So they know that this is very, very difficult to achieve and that there are many, many hurdles before they can reach this aim. One of the things they have to influence is public opinion about this potential step. And of course, if people in NATO countries feel threatened, especially those who have an experience of being part of the Soviet Union and having a comparatively strong hatred against Russia, at least among parts of the population. I think if you can make this population feel extremely insecure about the situation, whether or not the Russians will hit them, yes or not, I think it is a good way of influencing public opinion. But I'm not a military specialist, but when I talk to people who know more about this issue than I do, they explain to me that maybe Ukraine was actually using the air above these Baltic countries to direct drones to Russia, because Russia would then come to the conclusion that these countries allowed Ukraine drones to fly over their territories and hit Russia from a direction that Russia so far had excluded as a possibility because they assess the situation that usually NATO countries don't want to be involved in this way. This is, by the way, also true for Finland. Finland is actually regarded by Russia as a co-combatant country. Why? Because according to Russian assessments, I'm not saying that this is true, but it is important to know that Russia thinks that Finland has already allowed for Ukraine to launch drones and missiles from Finnish territory. So this implies that maybe Ukraine is not preventing for a Russian drone to hit one of those countries that are extremely afraid of Russia, including the Baltic countries, but that was actually using their airspace to access Russia, then make Russia nervous about this situation and build up the potential in Russia that they finally come to the conclusion that they can no longer allow for these NATO countries to be indirectly involved and that they have to hit those countries in order for them to react by then entering the war directly. And I think maybe this is the calculation behind these moves.
You might be right about that. These Ukrainian drones weren't targeting the Baltic states, so they were probably targeting Russia, but they were They were infringing on their airspace, making it look like either they were launched from the Baltic states or that the Baltic states agreed to have their airspace used, in effect, wanting to cause this escalation, which would be very dangerous for all of us. Lithuania is the largest Baltic state, and it borders Kaliningrad, a sliver of Russian territory sandwiched between Lithuania and Poland. Kaliningrad, let us not forget, is home to nuclear-capable Russian Iskander missile systems. It is close to the so-called Suwalki Gap, which is a narrow 65-kilometer, which is 40 miles, land corridor between Poland and Lithuania. This corridor is part of NATO, and it separates Kaliningrad from Belarus, and it is seen as NATO's most vulnerable choke point. So military analysts warn that the Russian military could attempt to sever the Suwalki Gap from Kaliningrad and Belarus to isolate the Baltic states before NATO could respond. So is this a real possibility, or are these hawks trying to escalate the war by spreading stories like this about the Russians closing the Suwalki Gap and the Baltic countries then being cut off from the rest of Europe?
We should definitely take this seriously, but we should take it seriously from both sides. So if NATO wants to do something against Russia, it will go against Kaliningrad. And if Russia wants to do something against NATO, it will also move in this corridor. So from my point of view, this is a very fragile and very, very highly dangerous situation there. A situation like this can only be upheld if there is some kind of communication and some kind of confidence. So I think it is highly probable that if anything happens between Russia and the rest of Europe, then something will happen up there. And it is constructed as a place where a war can begin. And we should also be aware of the fact that leading NATO generals have already discussed the possibility of hitting Kaliningrad. We should also be aware of the fact that now countries adjacent to the Baltic Seas are trying to take over the Baltic Seas and not allow the Russians that only have a very narrow access to the international waters of the Baltic Sea not to use the Baltic Sea anymore. And why do they do this? Because they anticipate that maybe Russia is going to cut off Ukraine from the Black Sea. And so they want to have the Baltic Sea as a bargaining chip in a future new situation around the Black Sea. And I think all the kind of measures that the Europeans are taking now in the Baltic Seas will also make the Russians extremely nervous. Everybody needs to watch the situation up there very closely, because if anything going to happen between Russia and the rest of Europe, it will definitely happen up there.
Let us not forget that it was the Ukrainians who blew up the Nord Stream pipeline and not the Russians. We know that now. So probably what you said is true, that they're trying to take over the whole sea up there. And they don't want Russian energy flowing to Europe as well. Are we backing into World War III, do you think? Is Ukraine, EU, and Russia backing into World War III? Or is there a way to solve this peacefully?
First of all, I would say that in a situation like the one in which we are, we always have to calculate that the probability of a local war developing into a regional war and a regional war developing into a world war is extremely high. This is the very unfortunate situation we are in, and it is a situation where maybe people should think more about how to avoid this. But unfortunately, they don't do this, especially among politicians in Europe. Secondly, I would say that maybe our politicians in Europe are like the politicians before World War I. There's sleepwalking into a war situation that then develops into a world war situation. I think this is possible. However, it is a criticism of what we are encountering from the side of our politicians at this moment. Because one could also, after everything we discussed today in our conversation, one could come to the conclusion that these politicians are not sleepwalking into a war. They somehow think that they can run the risk of a war, to put it very mildly. And I think there's one thing we can learn from the recent wars that are going on in front of our eyes, that very often politicians calculate the best case scenario, but war then develops into the worst case scenario. The reason why politicians who are human beings and who do not want to die in a war dare to go to war against some other nation is because they calculate the best case scenario. Look at Israel and the US. What did they calculate? The best case scenario. What evolved from their calculation? The worst case scenario. Maybe not the worst case scenario, but it was definitely developing into this direction. Look at President Putin going to war against Ukraine. He thought he could solve the problem within a very short period of time. He calculated on the best case scenario, but it's definitely not his scenario that is actually evolving in front of our eyes. It's more developing into a worst case scenario. And the worst case scenario for the Ukraine would be for local war developing into a regional war in Europe, and this regional war being the beginning of a world war, right? So the idea that you can go to war for a limited period of time and this war will only affect a very limited piece of territory, this idea has proven to be wrong too often. And that is why I think we should convince our politicians and the leaders of our armies that they have to think more about avoiding war than about preparing war. Although one must realistically say that preparing for a potential war can and should be part of a strategy of avoiding war. Because unfortunately, when it comes to war and peace, the question whether or not you have a good military backing you in your diplomatic endeavors play a very, very important role. So preparing for war has to be accompanied by avoiding war, and avoiding war has to be the aim, whereas preparing for war only has a complementary function. This is how I would assess the situation.
Well, I hope lots of politicians hear our podcast and hear what you just said.
Well, I think maybe we will have to wait a little until they finally come to the conclusion that they need to listen to our podcast. But our politicians still want us to cast a vote for them. And as long as we're living in democratic political systems, maybe if we can convince more and more listeners that we should support only those politicians that know that avoidance of war is more important than preparing for war, then maybe the situation will change. Let's hope for the best.
Let's hope for the best, Suzanne. Thank you very much for this very good conversation.
Thank you for asking your always enormously interesting and challenging questions. And let's see you again in 1 week's time.
I'll see you again, Suzanne. And for our listeners and watchers, thank you very much for tuning in to another session of iGlobe Views. Remember to like, subscribe, and follow. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.